Following the death of Walt Disney in 1966, the Disney studio was sent into a state of disarray. Veteran storytellers struggled to adapt to a workflow without his leadership, and new studio heads were unable to match his business prowess. With more focus put on money-making than artistic brilliance, artists began to struggle under their new limitations. Film budgets were stripped and cheaper processes were beginning to become the norm. The Xerox process, which emerged in the previous era, was heavily utilized, and its resulting scratchy, ugly animation became the default trademark style of the era. With Disney's veterans slowly retiring, the films were also taking longer to make, as a new guard of artists were ushered in to learn the ropes. This 18-year period saw the release of 8 animated features, most of which were met with mixed box office and critical reception, particularly in comparison to those in Walt's lifetime. In an effort to make the films more appealing in an era where the Disney brand was seen as box office poison, the films focused on darker, more mature material, and were thus considered inferior to and lacking the heart of Walt's classics. As a result, the era would go on to be known as the Dark Age of Disney animation, though in more neutral terms is also known as the Bronze Age, or more formally, the Early Renaissance. The era spanned the entire feature output from 1970's The Aristocats, the last film to be greenlit by Walt, through to 1988's Oliver and Company, the first produced without Walt's 9 Old Men. This era is most notable for its grungy and scratchy look, basic cost-cutting animation, exploration of dark themes, underwhelming features, and enduring cult classics. In this video, I aim to rank the entire 8-picture Disney Dark Age, in order of my own personal preference. At that, let's get into it. Kicking us off at number 8, The Fox and the Hound. The fourth film of the Disney Dark Age was most certainly a turning point for the studio. As many of the studio veterans began to drift away, those remaining were in the midst of handing over to the new guard as they worked on their final film. The movie notably marked the arrival of Renaissance greats and gave a start to filmmakers Tim Burton and John Lasseter. As a sort of in-between film, there was an almost hodgepodge homemade feel to it, with the juxtaposition between experienced and inexperienced artists incredibly noticeable in both visual and narrative style. The artwork appears incredibly simple and generic, with very little detail or texture and rigid character animation. It lacks the traditional Disney style and feels off-brand. The simplistic watercolor backgrounds, though, to be fair, are quite beautiful and a highlight of the film's visual design. Even though I've placed it right down the bottom, it is hard to stay harsh with this movie, as the simplicity of it is the result of the new bloods learning the ropes. Though with the movie oddly produced on a budget 3 times higher than the previous 5 films, one wonders how it so surely missed its mark. On a more positive note, it's hard to denounce the film's story, which is incredibly heartfelt and timeless, filled with great morals and a pair of enchanting lead characters, though perhaps bordering on being too cutesy. Other than this, I do find it hard to see much else all that interesting or captivating here. 7. Oliver and Company. The final film of the Dark Age, and the first not to feature involvement from any of the 9 Old Men, Oliver is a really weird entry in the Disney canon. Considered the first modern, suburban Disney animation, it's clear that storytellers were trying to change the direction of their features, ushering them into a new era by making something that felt of the now, with more modern, hip characters, setting, voice artists, and music, instead of something that felt fantastical and set long ago in faraway lands. While this does work in some respects, it's an incredibly nice twist on the Disney formula. It's ultimately the downfall of the movie. Oliver feels incredibly dated, losing that timeless quality of the majority of classics, and could easily be lumped in with many of the other generic animated features from the era, such as All Dogs Go to Heaven. That said, Oliver is a nice little detour. It's artistically great, with artists clearly making a conscious effort to make the movies look nicer by this point, and using restrictions to their benefit. In fact, the artistic style of Oliver is possibly the best of the Dark Age films, with a style that feels closer to that of the Renaissance period, making for a nice precursor to it. Narratively though, the film isn't up to their level, with weak characters and a fairly trudgy generic story that again simply doesn't hold up, feeling too much a product of its time. 6. The Black Cauldron. arguably Disney's darkest animated film ever. Cauldron is in turn one of the least Disney movies ever, not only because of its dark tone and subject matter, but also because of its inferior quality. The movie is a decent showcase of artistic design. There's gorgeous background art here, but the character animation is far from perfect, a little rigid and even jolty at times. This comes down to the film being the first to almost entirely be produced by the new guard of animators, and the first affected by the emergence of a new studio hierarchy, particularly that of head of animation Jeffrey Katzenberg, who made notoriously controversial cuts to the film. Black Cauldron in that respect is almost like a work-in-progress film or a test reel for the incredible work that these new artists would do over the next decade. In fact, the whole existence of the film shows the desire these filmmakers had in returning to fantasy fairy tale type storytelling. However, with its drab, muted palette and lack of colours, Black Cauldron simply feels like a generic 80s animation from one of Disney's rival studios. The film has a short runtime of only 80 minutes, but strangely feels like it drags. It also has a stilted narrative that never quite feels complete, likely because of those Katzenberg cuts, a reported 12 minutes of completed animation. The movie does show promise and desire, but simply doesn't feel cut from the Disney mold. 5. Robin Hood. As the second film in the Dark Age, Robin Hood marked the first noticeable downgrade for the studio, despite being produced by various Disney veterans on a fairly substantial budget for the era. Out of all the films produced with the Xerox process, I believe it to be the scratchiest of them all, with an incredibly bland visual style that isn't helped by the Xerox's grungy look. The disarrayed state of many of the studio is entirely evident as well, with an abundance of animation shortcuts such as reused rotoscoped animation and various duplicated characters scattered throughout. Corners also appear to be cut on animation detail, especially in faces, textures, and natural effects such as light and water. The film features annoying and over-the-top characters that don't feel fleshed out, and even at only 84 minutes long, it feels slow, sluggish, narratively jumbled, and, well, honestly, fairly boring. Regardless, there's something charming about the picture. The songs are fun and highly original, and the score is one of Disney's best. While I loved this one as a kid, it's one that hasn't continued to grow with me, though there is still something in it that feels so warm, enchanting, and nostalgic. 4. The Rescuers. The Rescuers is plagued by many of the hallmarks of the Dark Age. It's dark and gloomy with subpar, overly simplistic animation. Strangely, however, the film's simplicity manages to somehow work for its narrative. As a small-scale adventure on many levels, simplicity is simply the key to making the movie work as well as it does. Beneath the glum exterior, Rescuers does feature some charming characters with good character animation and some fairly enjoyable moments. It holds some of the most exciting action and adventure of the era and features gags that are worthy of any Walt era animation, certainly helped by the work of Disney's 9 old men, a majority of whom were on board the production. In fact, I truly believe that the heart and soul that these particular filmmakers tried to inject into this film amidst a crumbling studio hierarchy saves it from being a complete disaster. There's an obvious struggle here between filmmakers wanting to truly make a great movie and a studio who just wanted to make one on the cheap, perhaps even more so than any of the era's other films. Overall though, Rescuers stands out as a Dark Age highlight, even if simply for being a last-ditch effort to bring Disney animation back to its former glory, by those who were there in its earliest days. 3. The Many Adventures of Winnie the Pooh. One of the only features in the Dark Age and the final ever to have the personal touch of Walt Disney bestowed upon it. Many Adventures is essentially a package feature, which stitched together 3 previously released short subjects, including 1966's Winnie the Pooh and the Honey Tree, a personal project of Walt's. There has been some suggestion that Walt had a grand plan to release a Pooh feature utilizing parceled short films, though this has been disputed over the years. Regardless, with ideas drying up in the immediate aftermath of his death, the studio turned to this idea to meet some kind of release quota. That's not to say the film is lazy by any means, it's fairly ingenious in its devices, framing the shorts as chapters within a greater Pooh story. It was also a labour of love produced in tribute to a fallen friend. All said, it's kind of hard to judge this one against the other films in the era, considering its nature. However, it's also incredibly hard to ignore the charm of Winnie the Pooh and the artist's honest desire to make something really special. Many Adventures is a truly gorgeous feature, full of love and joy, and it's one of the most charming, wondrous, and enduring Disney features ever, never feeling out of place. It's a welcome entry in the canon, and one that's meant a great deal to me for most of my life. 2. The Aristocats. Walt Disney workshopped the Aristocats story with numerous storymen throughout the 1960s and signed off on storyboards and concept sketches shortly before his death, making it the final animated film to get his green light. Walt assigned Ken Anderson head of story and Willie Reitherman director, and personally chose Phil Harris as the voice of Thomas O'Malley. It's Walt's touches and creative decisions during the early stages of production that make Aristocats so special, encapsulating the heart, soul, and liveliness of his classic features. Aristocats features a roster of fantastically fun characters and an exciting and energetic story. Its vivacious, jazzy soundtrack is a personal highlight for me, with the Everybody Wants to Be a Cat sequence one of my favourite Disney musical moments. Despite all the highlights, the film does feel a little off in some instances, with the cracks from Disney's departure beginning to form early on. The gag writing isn't as hilarious as previous efforts, and its low budget led to the usual agrarious visual anomalies. The use of Xerox, though, due to the grungy nature of the film, its characters and its setting, actually works quite well and is fitting of it. All in all, however, Aristocats is easily a highlight of the Dark Age, and makes for a decent bridge between the old guard and the new, showing the final sparks of Disney magic. And coming in as my number 1 Disney Dark Age film, Basil, the Great Mouse Detective. Easily the most stylish and visually stunning film of the Dark Age. The film highlights the benefits of the Xerox process, using its scratchy look to great effect, and also employing a wonderful use of film grain, giving the movie an incredibly atmospheric look, perfectly apt for its 19th century setting. Most notably, the film's finale, set atop Big Ben in a rainstorm, is absolutely stunning, even applying the first major use of computer animation in a feature film. With a $14 million budget, all stops were pulled out. Not only in the stunning attention to visual design, the most attentive since the death of Walt Disney, but also in the talent involved. Cinema great Vincent Price voiced the delightfully evil villain Ratigan, while legendary composer Henry Mancini delivered an incredible score, giving the film an extremely cinematic feel. The movie also marks one of the first films to be majorly controlled by the new guard, who had finally found their bearing, and the first Disney animation to be directed by John Musker and Ron Clements, who later went on to direct The Little Mermaid, Aladdin, and Moana, among others. Though the movie starts off incredibly strong as a viscerally enjoyable dark drama, the story does dwindle towards the last act, likely due to studio interference, and spirals into a generic, silly story involving robots that feels totally out of left field and off-brand. Despite that, The Great Mouse Detective is perhaps the most daring and adventurous film of the Dark Age, and one of the most underappreciated films in the entire Disney canon. And at that, it's over to you. How do you personally rank the Disney Dark Age movies? Which ones do you love? Which ones do you love not so much? Fire away down in the comments below with your rankings and thoughts. But as always, guys, stay civil. No two rankings will ever be the same. If this is your first time viewing one of my videos and you'd like to see more like it in the future, then please don't forget to hit that big old subscribe button up on your screen, as well as that like button down below for that little extra support. Also, don't forget to check me out on social media, and please consider supporting me over on Patreon. Thanks for watching and have a fantastic day.